Suicide of the West. An essay on the meaning and destiny of liberalism. James Burnham. Chapter 13, again, who are the liberals?
In Chapter 2, I answered the question, who are the liberals, in a manner that Socrates would have termed inductive, by pointing to existing persons and institutions that are called liberal. By implication, several additional answers were given in the course of the intervening chapters. A liberal is a person or organization adhering to all or most of the 19 beliefs listed in chapters 3 to 5. A liberal is a person characterized by the cluster of values and attitudes discussed in chapters 9 to 11. I want to add, in rough summary, what I suppose would be considered a sociological answer if it were phrased in the accredited terminology and accompanied by statistical summaries of elaborate questionnaires. I will now interpret the question, who are the liberals, to mean, what are the social groups, classes, strata, types or occupations that most incline toward liberalism? A group's inclination toward liberalism is shown, presumably, when we find a relatively high percentage of liberals among its members, along with a tendency of the interest organizations supported by its members to put forward a liberal program. To be sure, there are orthodox liberals in every class and stratum of modern society, from kings to latrine attendants. No group has a total immunity to the virus of a major ideology. You can find persons who are convinced liberals even though it can be demonstrated that the consequences of liberal beliefs and programs are directly counter to the interests of the group to which they belong and their own individual interests, for the sake of the ideology in which they believe they are willing to ignore or to sacrifice those interests. If liberals were scattered according to a random pattern throughout all social strata, liberalism would lack a significant social dimension, and could be analyzed sufficiently in psychological and philosophical terms. But this is not the case. The fact is that there is a much heavier concentration of liberals in some social formations than in others. There are some in which liberals are as rare as triplets. It follows that there are social as well as psychological factors determining belief in liberalism, that through its capacity to fulfill certain social needs, or psychological needs characterizing certain social groups, and to advance certain social interests, liberalism has a closer natural affinity with some groups and some types of person than with others. Let us begin in reverse, by noting some of the persons who are not liberals, more exactly, some of the social groups among the members of which there is a relatively low percentage of liberals. I am limiting my inquiry here to the arrangements that may be readily observed within the advanced nations of Western civilization, in particular the United States. To begin with, very few professional, career, military men are liberals. Some military men have a certain number of liberal ideas, and in a nation like the United States or Britain, where liberalism has become the prevailing tendency in the makeup of public opinion, most military men, like everybody else, exhibit a certain amount of liberal coloration in their rhetoric. But few military men are orthodox liberals, and almost none are liberal ideologues. Liberalism and the military life just do not fit well together. A military man doesn't seem able to feel like a liberal and act like a liberal, even when he professes a liberal set of beliefs. This incompatibility between liberalism and the military life, and many of the reasons for it, are obvious and well known. Concepts of equality, non-discrimination and universal democracy are hard to reconcile with the inequalities, authoritarianism, detailed discrimination and rigid hierarchy that are always and inevitably characteristic of military organization. Even if they can be reconciled by some sort of complicated logical exercise, there remains a feeling gap. In his scale of priorities, the soldier is professionally committed to place the safety and survival of his country first, and to be ready to sacrifice his life as well as his freedoms and comforts thereto. He must keep the values of social justice and individual rights secondary in rank, if he is to do his soldierly duty, and his devotion to peace, however fervently protested, will always be confused by the fact that his trade is war. Liberals have always given implicit recognition to this natural state of affairs by their normal hostility to the military. There is nothing a liberal columnist more enjoys attacking than the military mind. For a liberal audience it is considered an adequate refutation of a proposal or policy if it can be shown that retired generals and admirals support it. Every liberal realizes that when the army intervenes, or is thought to be intervening, in one of the bi-monthly Latin American revolutions, it is acting as a limb of Satan. Learned treatises by Columbia professors or lurid novels by Hollywood-pointed journalists are assured of massive royalties if they reveal how fascist types in the Pentagon, if not stopped at the 11th hour by Sir Galahad Liberal, are plotting to take over the country, and plunge the world into a nuclear shambles in the process. Several circumstances are presently tending to breach the wall between liberalism and the military mind. Technological change brings into the military force more and more persons exercising civilian skills, administrative, technical, scientific, that lack the inbred immunity of the older, narrower military vocation to liberal ideas and values. As liberalism becomes ascendant in public opinion, the soldiers to be absorb liberal ideas from the educational process, and after entering military service continue to be bathed in liberal ideas and rhetoric pouring from newspapers, magazines, books, television and sermons. And as liberal civilians move into the positions of governmental power in a nation with a tradition of civilian supremacy, they begin deliberate moves to alter the military mind according to liberal prescriptions, by suitable indoctrination and censorship, demotions or dismissals of stubborn anti-liberals, manipulation of key appointments and so on. But the military dough proves hard to knead. Generals and admirals can be found who will, up to a point, read liberal written speeches and echo when questioned the opinions formulated by the reigning liberal ideologues. But somehow the liberalism doesn't seem to sink in, when the less supervised life of inactive service, or a guerrilla war, begins, the liberalism sloughs off in a month or two, and the rattle of the unregenerate military serpent is again heard in the land. You have to search through an unconscionable deal of letterheads of liberal organizations before you can come up with a pennyworth of military names. A second group or class in which liberals are few and far between is that of the businessmen who both own all or a controlling share of their enterprises, especially in manufacturing, mining, transport, construction and other primary fields, and actively run them. In this class, the small businessmen, who often incline to what the French have come to know as pugilism, differ in typical ideology from the remnant of large operators, but both are overwhelmingly anti-liberal. It is from their ranks that many, perhaps most, of the advertisers in avowedly anti-liberal publications and contributors to anti-liberal organizations are drawn. Among most sorts of what Americans call businessmen, the conquests of liberalism are limited, as the anti-liberal programs of many major business associations indicate, but the active owners are considerably more anti-liberal than the rest. A fair number of the executives of various grades in the corporations that have shifted from stockholder to management control, in merchandising and in banking, investment, insurance and other services become liberals or at least take up a good many liberal ideas and beliefs, and the families with inherited wealth turn out some of the most conspicuous liberals. A product that seems to be an unstable blend of the standard gilt, a somewhat condescending idealism and rather sly calculation. Among professionals the ratios are more complicated. Generally speaking, the percentage of liberals is low among independent, self-employed doctors, dentists, engineers, and others of what might be called the less verbal professions. Many of the doctors who work as salaried employees or administrators of governmental and other public agencies, or of research institutes, foundations, large clinics and even large corporations, are liberals, often thoroughly ideologized, when they have not moved beyond liberalism to socialism or communism. But in the United States and the small number of other nations where medicine has not been fully nationalized, the percentage among the self-employed doctors is much lower. There is a similar difference in the other professions, though the ratio of liberals is probably higher among dentists, possibly because of their ambiguous social status, and among lawyers, whose profession is more verbal and more likely to make them feel at home among such abstractions as proliferate in liberal ideology. Independent farm owners and operators are seldom liberals. When they seem to be, as the programs of some of the farm organizations might seem to suggest, their liberalism is in most cases a transparent disguise for solid economic demands. Indeed, liberalism flourishes much more readily in an urban than in a rural environment, in the big cities more than on the farms or in the small towns. This, too, has often been remarked, and is an axiom for practical politicians figuring how votes will go. It is perhaps the explanation why modern liberalism is more pervasive in England and the United States than on the European continent, where a much larger percentage of the population is still on the land and in the villages. When the rural population becomes radical in large numbers, it does not turn typically to liberalism in the modern sense but to less polished, wilder and more violent doctrines and programs, to cheap money panaceas, rural anarchism, communism, vigilantism, racial and religious hate movements, and for that matter fascism. In the United States a high and significant ratio of liberals is to be found on the faculties of the large colleges and universities outside the South. Even in the southern universities and in the smaller colleges, except for some of the strictly sectarian institutions, the percentage of liberals on the faculties is in almost all cases considerably higher than in the communities from which the student body is drawn. This is true also of the secondary schools, and to a smaller degree of the primary schools as well, though in many areas the primary teachers are likely to be more closely tied to the rest of the community. But in many of the most influential universities, which in the long run dominate the entire educational system, since their graduates teach those who teach the teachers, the percentage of liberals has for several decades been very high indeed. In some of these universities such departments as philosophy, political science, history, government, economics, literature, or American civilization, various alternate names are used to designate the departmentalized fields into which the curriculum is divided, are manned 100% by liberals. In many others one or two tame non-liberals are included within each department as if to display the liberal devotion to free speech by a kind of token integration. In other advanced Western nations, also, the ideology of many teachers comes within the boundaries of modern liberalism as this book has defined it, or largely overlaps modern liberalism. There is often a more explicit admixture of socialism, but we have noted that contemporary reformist socialism and liberalism have moved into close coincidence. In countries like France and Italy, however, where there exist mass communist parties, a considerable number of teachers have moved on into communism or fellow traveling. Such a leftward shift in the spectrum from liberalism toward communism takes place in these countries, in fact, not only among teachers but in most categories of the population. Liberalism is prevalent among all sorts of opinion makers as well as the teachers, editors, publishers, ministers and preachers, columnists, commentators, writers, miscellaneous intellectuals, all branches of the entertainment industry. In these cases, too, the spectrum in France and Italy shows a displacement of part of the liberal band toward the further left. Generalizing, we may say that those who by career and occupation are verbalists exhibit an above-average predilection for liberalism. Not surprisingly, social service workers, whose occupational interests are fully incorporated within the liberal ideology, are mostly liberals. By a somewhat lower but still high percentage, so are the multitudinous civil service workers and bureaucrats who man the gigantic mechanism of the welfare state. In fact, a second-wide generalization seems valid: those who, as employees, administrators, staff members or in other capacities, make their living from tax-exempt institutions, including governmental and semi-governmental institutions, exhibit an above-average predilection for liberalism. Governmental bureaucrats are on average more liberal than the corresponding employees of private business. The permanent staffs of non-profit educational, philanthropic and scientific foundations are on average more liberal than the trustees, and more liberal than the staffs of profit-making organizations of a comparable type. And we have already noted that doctors working for governmental agencies or working full-time for hospitals, universities, or group health organizations are on average more liberal than doctors self-employed in individual practice. This institutional category overlaps the category of verbalists, teachers, ministers, employees of university and governmental publishing houses, and many public relations experts are verbalists who make their living from tax-exempt institutions. In the last section I mentioned that, though the liberal concentration among businessmen is generally low, it is relatively higher in the management strata of publicly owned enterprises, that is, those run by management itself or by some fiscal control group, than of those run by an individual, family or small group having a major ownership interest. It may be observed that managerial liberalism tends to be more moderate than the liberalism of the verbalists, tends to be the sort of centrist liberalism represented by many of the publications of the Committee for Economic Development in the United States or the Bow Group in Britain, or by what Professor Arthur Larson christened, during his brief moment of public blooming under the Eisenhower sun, modern republicanism. A pure ideologue believes in his ideology for its own sake, because it meets his intellectual demands and satisfies his emotional needs, not for its ability to serve his practical interests or those of the group with which he associates himself. He is prepared, indeed, to disregard and sometimes to negate those practical interests for the sake of his ideology. Undoubtedly there are liberals who are pure ideologues, but it is hard to draw an exact line. Even when the ideologue is utterly sincere in heart, subjectively considered, it will often happen that his ideology will at the same time, in some measure, give an assist to his practical interests, even help fill his wallet. And for some an ideology is no more than a useful masquerade. It is manifest on the surface that the rough correlations here surveyed between liberalism and one set of social groups, and between non-liberalism and another set, may well have some connection with the differing interests of these diverse groups as well as with the subjective ideas of their members. When we consider the large group of persons whom we call workers, it is almost impossible to assess the ideological component. Liberalism has, certainly, a warm spot in its ideological heart for workers, and liberals have made the improvement of the condition of the working class one of their persistent aims. The traditional demands of workers for the right to organize, picket and strike and to raise their standard of living are in keeping with liberal doctrine and supported by liberal programs. In the United States the majority of the leaders of the primary organizations of workers, the trade unions, profess to be liberals, and the unions support many liberal policies and proposals in addition to those that are of direct and peculiar proletarian concern. And there is a fairly close relation between many outstanding liberal politicians and the trade union movement. Nevertheless we may easily exaggerate the ideological liberalism of the mass of workers, perhaps even of the labor leaders. Opinion polls giving results broken down by income and educational level and by occupation seem to back up day-by-day experience in suggesting that most workers do not share the key political and philosophical ideas of liberalism, are, in fact, disturbingly reactionary by liberal standards. The workers stick fairly hard-headedly to their practical search for higher wages, better living conditions and increased security. They adopt and adapt just enough of liberalism to further their goals, and are not much interested in the remainder. It is also true that the trade unions, as organized, active subgroups of the nation, find liberalism a favorable environment in which to operate. Both the psychological atmosphere generated by the liberal doctrines and the political paths opened up by the procedural rules of the liberals' open society give the unions freedom and flexibility for maneuver. And this is no doubt another important factor suggesting to the labor leadership that a public image of liberalism, whether an accurate portrait or not, is useful. Indeed, liberalism tends to serve the interests, or can be made to serve the interests, of almost any cohesive minority subgroup, as can readily be seen in recent American history in the case of the Roman Catholics, the Jews and most lately the Negroes. It is therefore natural enough that such subgroups should incline outwardly toward liberal ideology. An overwhelming majority of American Jews is liberal in public profession, and a considerable proportion of the most influential liberal ideologues is Jewish in origin if not always in active faith. The potential of a liberal environment for a cohesive minority may be part of the explanation for the seeming anomaly that we remarked in earlier chapters, the adoption of liberalism by a good many Catholic spokesmen in spite of the difficulty in reconciling Catholic philosophy and theology with some parts of the liberal ideology. The American Negroes are only beginning to develop cohesiveness as a subgroup, but they have had many sorts of internal association for some time, and of the major organizations concerned with Negro interests and composed primarily of Negroes, all except the black Muslims have in the past been professedly liberal in doctrine and for the most part in leadership. However, as in the case of the trade unions, one must wonder how deep, ideologically speaking, is the liberalism of the generality of members of subgroups such as these, whether it may not in some measure merely reflect the social position of these subgroups as minorities in both size and effective power. Where they are an effective majority, or manage to win preponderant power, like the Catholics, for example, in Spain or a number of Latin American countries or even South Vietnam under the no-family regime, or the Jews in Israel, or the Negroes in African nations, they don't seem to be so very liberal. This may be another instance of Veuillet's law. Machiavelli divided rulers and aspirants to rule into lions and foxes, the lions who rely on strength, stubbornness and force, the foxes who rely on their wits, on shrewdness, deceit and fraud. Plainly enough, the liberals, especially the two great divisions of liberals recruited from the verbalists and from the employees of governmental agencies and tax-exempt institutions, belong to the foxes. It would occur to no one, surely, to classify Arthur Schlesinger, Jr., Hubert Humphrey, Walt Whitman Rostow or Adlai Stevenson among the lions. Vilfredo Pareto elaborates this Machiavellian distinction in terms of his theory of residues. Although he lists 6 classes of residues, he pays most attention to the first 2. Class 1 amounts to an instinct for combinations. Persons characterized by Class 1 residues have a tendency to try to combine and manipulate all sorts of elements from experience. As part of their manipulation of words, they are the ones who put together complicated theories and ideologies. They lack strong attachments to family, church, nation and tradition, though they may exploit these attachments in others. They are inventive, and in economic and political affairs, inclined toward novelty and change. In practical conduct, they do not plan very far ahead, but count on their ability to bypass the challenges that may arise, or to improvise answers. These are, in a word, Machiavelli's foxes. The lions are, in Pareto's terminology, the individuals who are marked by the Class 2 residues of group persistence. They are conservative in attitude, with a deep sense of the objectivity and permanence of family, nation and church. Family pride, love of country, concern with property, as a permanent part of a man's and a family's reality are given emotional force by the Class 2 residues. In economic affairs, the Class 2 individuals, the lions, tend to be more cautious, saving and orthodox, more worried over sound money, than the foxes. They praise character and duty more often than brains. And they are willing to use force to maintain the entities, family, class, nation, the true faith, to which they are attached. During this century the liberal ideology has gradually increased its influence over the formation of public opinion within the United States, Britain, Italy and to a greater or less degree nearly all the advanced Western nations, and at the same time liberals, or persons accepting the liberal ideas relating to the decisive issues of war and the social order, have come to occupy more and more of the key positions of governmental and social power. This has meant a basic shift in the governing mix of Western civilization. The foxes have been getting rid of the lions, as one of them put it a few years ago, have been fading away. Within the governing elite, Class 1 residues are gaining more and more exclusive predominance over Class 2. Pareto summarizes the normal development of such a condition in the following general terms.
1. A mere handful of citizens, so long as they are willing to use violence, can force their will upon public officials who are not inclined to meet violence with equal violence. If the reluctance of the officials to resort to force is primarily motivated by humanitarian sentiments, that result ensues very readily, but if they refrain from violence because they deem it wiser to use some other means, the effect is often the following. 2. To prevent or resist violence, the governing class resorts to diplomacy, fraud, corruption, governmental authority passes, in a word, from the lions to the foxes. The governing class bows its head under the threat of violence, but it surrenders only in appearances, trying to turn the flank of the obstacle it cannot demolish in frontal attack. In the long run that sort of procedure comes to exercise a far-reaching influence on the selection of the governing class, which is now recruited only from the foxes, while the lions are blackballed. The individual who best knows the arts of winning back by fraud and deceit what seemed to have been surrendered under pressure of force, is now leaders of leaders. The man who has bursts of rebellion, and does not know how to crook his spine at the proper times and places, is the worst of leaders, and his presence is tolerated among them only if other distinguished endowments offset that defect. 3. So it comes about that the residues of the combination instinct, class 1, are intensified in the governing class, and the residues of group persistence, class 2, debilitated, for the combination residue supply, precisely, the artistry and resourcefulness required for evolving ingenious expedients as substitutes for open resistance, while the residues of group persistence stimulate open resistance, since a strong sentiment of group persistence cures the spine of all tendencies to curvature. 4. Policies of the governing class are not planned too far ahead in time. Predominance of the combination instincts and enfeeblement of the sentiments of group persistence result in making the governing class more satisfied with the present and less thoughtful of the future. Material interests and interests of the present or a near future come to prevail over the ideal interests of community or nation and interests of the distant future. 5. Some of these phenomena become observable in international relations as well. Efforts are made to avoid conflicts with the powerful, and the sword is rattled only before the weak. The country is often unwittingly edged toward war by nursings of disputes, which, it is expected, will never get out of control and turn into armed conflicts. Not seldom, however, a war will be forced upon the country by peoples who are not so far advanced in the evolution that leads to the predominance of class 1 residues.